Hello and welcome to Educated STEM. I am Kate, the founder of Educated STEM, and today we're going to continue our journey with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Mahadeo Sukhai. We have a first series of videos where we talk about his lived experiences as a low vision scientist and his career. And now we're doing a deep dive into DEI, or IDEA, as he prefers to say it. So today I'm going to ask him the question, how do you do science through DEI or IDEA? So Mahadeo.
That's a good question, Kate. So you know what the research life cycle is?
I probably should.
So the research life cycle is sort of this sort of cyclical process that we can use as a schematic for how we do research, right? So we develop a research question, and often we develop a research question because of an observation that we're making, or something that we constitute, as preliminary data, right? And that can come from a previous study, which is why this is cyclical. So we develop a research question. And then when we have that research question, we assemble a team and we go through the process of figuring out how we're gonna tackle this. What's our hypothesis? What's the approach we're going to use to figure this out? And then we go through the research ethics process as needed. We go through the data collection process, which if we're talking about human-centered research, usually involves the recruitment and engagement of human participants, and the collection of data. And then once we've gathered the data, we're going to interpret the data. We're going to analyze the data, interpret the data, and then figure out what the results are trying to tell us, and then go back and tell the world what the results have told us. And in the telling of the world what the results have told us, somewhere along the line, a new question will arise, which is, as I say, why this is cyclical. So that's the gist of the research life cycle. When we talk about, actually, no, I'm going to back up and rephrase that. When in the context of HR, human resources, and business, the conversation around DEI or IDEA is raised, it's almost always raised in the context of who's around the table. And I got to tell you that all of the human resources arguments about why inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility are important don't really fly in the scientific workspace, right? Because they don't resonate, I find, with scientists. And so I think if you listen to an HR professional have this conversation about how DEI is good for you because it fosters innovation, a scientist is going to say, well, innovation's what we do, right? If you hear a human resources professional say that DEI hits the bottom line in a positive way, as scientists, we're not always conditioned to think in that sort of frame of reference, right? But on the other hand, if we think about what we talked about in the last video, which is inclusive science is good science, right? Then what we are really thinking about is how am I applying that lens of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility throughout the research life cycle? What's it mean to think about my research question through this lens? What's it mean to think about my data analysis, my data interpretation through this lens? What's it mean to think about data collection through this lens? What's it mean to build a team through this lens? And that's sort of the intersection with how human resources talks about it. But in reality, like my perspective on this is there is absolutely such a thing as science done well and done in such a way so that we are including all aspects of IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, in the doing of the science, right? We can think about, just from a data analysis and interpretation perspective, we can think about sources of bias. Where do sources of bias come from? And if we're thinking about sources of bias, can we actually address those sources of bias up front in the data collection or in the research design? Because often if we only do it in data analysis and interpretation, it's too late to do very much about too much of it. And so for me, the application of idea principles means always asking, is there a different way to do this? Is there something that I'm forgetting? Is there a group of humans that I'm forgetting? Is there a geography I'm forgetting? Is there a factor or a variable that I'm not thinking of that I should be thinking of, because that factor or variable could actually help me understand this question in a much different way, and perhaps even a better way than I'm thinking about it right now, right? The worst thing that we can do as scientific trainees is to design an experiment where we don't control for all of the possible variables, right? But you can only control for the variable if you know that the variable exists, Kate, right? And the way to do idea as a scientist, the way to embed idea in the research life cycle is to try to make sure that we are identifying and controlling for all those variables, right? Does that mean we have to bring different perspectives to the table? Does that mean we have to break down why are we asking the question that we are asking, right? I'll tell you an interesting story. At one point some years ago, I had a PhD student in engineering come to me, and he was looking for human research participants for his PhD project. And this PhD project had actually gotten ethics approval from his university already. And then he'd come to me and he said, look, I have ethics approval. I want to tell you about my project. Can you help me find research participants? And I said, sure. Tell me about your project. And he said, I've discovered that if you apply an electric shock to the cheek of a person, you will get a piezoelectric flash on the inside of a closed eyelid. And I said, well, that seems rather interesting, somewhat painful. What is the application of this, may I ask? And he said, well, don't you get it? If we apply a piezoelectric shock to the cheek of blind people, it'll help them navigate.
But that's going to be really painful and horrible. Why would you do that?
That's a great question. I said, okay, so how have you tested this? And he said, I tested this on myself and my PhD supervisor, and it worked on the two of us. And I said, are you cited? And he said, yes. I said, is your PhD supervisor cited? He said, yes. I said, okay. So why do you want to try this on persons with vision loss? And he said, isn't navigation a problem? And I said, sometimes it's a barrier. And he said, well, we've just solved it. And I said, no, you haven't. Right? I actually refused engagement in this study, and I told him it was a horrible idea scientifically, right? But again, his research ethics board had actually approved it, right? And so you know, how often is it that we think of a research question because we've observed something and we've taken something out of context, and we actually shouldn't be asking the question because perhaps it's the wrong question, right?
I mean, that sounds like a terrible question.
Well, it absolutely is a terrible question. Absolutely a terrible question, right? And that's what I said to this poor soul. But that's not uncommon. And particularly in the context of persons with disabilities, there's all sorts of research questions in rehab sciences or in biomedical or mechanical engineering where the question is asked because of an observation, and the observation is taken out of context and the context is never clarified, right? And yes, that's persons with disabilities, right? But as scientists, we can do that in lots of other contexts as well, right? So I think when we're thinking about how we are doing science, and we think about how are we doing the best, most rigorous, quote unquote, science that we can possibly do, right? When we think about the questions we ask and the processes that we undertake to figure out answers, test hypotheses, then we absolutely should be thinking about the principles of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, because those principles help us understand our biases. And if we can understand our biases, as I said before, we can figure out what the limitations of our thinking are, and we can address those limitations, right?
Yes. But I would hope that anybody would say, if the experiment or the solution would eventually cause presumably consistent pain, that's not a good thing.
No, it wouldn't be a good thing, right? And so I think you're fixating on the example rather than.
Oh no, I get it. But at the same time, like, I hope that anybody who's doing any sort of experiment will think of the comfort of the person you're doing it to, or the individuals who you're trying to help. You don't want them to be inconvenienced or in pain for eternity, but they can now miraculously see, or their eyes are now open,
so to speak. Yes.
Yes.
But even so, I think we can get caught up in the whole notion of proof of concept. We can get caught up in the pilot of the process as opposed to the translation from pilot to process. We can get caught up in this is a good question, but the question is limited in scope, right? And I think fundamentally, the application of idea principles to science help us to address those scope issues, help us to address the unconscious incompetence, right? We have research ethics panels, right? Institutional research ethics boards that are intended to correct for this, right? We have peer review that's intended to correct for this, both from a publication perspective and a funding perspective. But if they don't catch these things, then you have to wonder, is the system that is intended to work in a certain way actually working in a certain way? And if it's not, then what's the real barrier? Is it that these voids of knowledge, these unconscious incompetence elements, right, that the researchers have, are they being propagated through or reflected in the peer review space, right? So this from my perspective is sort of one of these deep philosophical questions about science, right? Because science is intended to be this thing that we do to learn something about the universe, to learn something about our world, to learn something about our society, right? And if the thing that we learn is narrower in scope, and we don't recognize that it's narrower in scope, then it's not going to be as helpful as we think it's supposed to be.
True. But I also think that, especially when you were talking about the ethics committee, because I can understand scientists going, yes, this is a super cool niche thing, and they wouldn't necessarily go straight to, but that's going to hurt someone or it's going to injure them or whatever. But from my understanding, on the ethics committee, there's always a non-scientist or a non-medical person, and one would hope that they would be like, wait a second. I may not understand the science, but that just sounds painful.
Yeah, but it's also dependent very much on how the research ethics questions are framed, the kind of information that's being asked for and collected, right? And to some degree, if you think about where the research ethics process came from, right? So the history of the research ethics process is that it really has its origins in human clinical trials in the immediately post World War II space, right? Because the whole point was to make sure that the patients who are being who are volunteering for, being encouraged to volunteer for these clinical trials were not going to be harmed, right? And so the language around disability and the framing around disability in the context of research ethics is actually very sort of deficit model kind of lack of competency to provide consent kind of language. And the questions that are asked are not around, well, how are you thinking about disability? Are you thinking about disability in the context of a deficit? Or are you thinking about disability in the context of barriers to be removed? This particular thing that you have in mind as a research project? How are you conceiving of it through that lens of inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility? Like, those questions aren't being asked, right? And so if you don't ask the question, you will never get the answer, or you'll never get anyone's perspective of the answer. And I think this is where research ethics committees sort of run into their own barrier, because if you do a deep dive on research ethics questions, like if you look at the research ethics forums from multiple institutions, what you can actually get is a bit of a triangulation of what's missing from all of them, right? And particularly in the context of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, the way that the questions are set up, there's a very sort of dominant culture perspective to a lot of the questions, and there's this sort of notion that if somebody is a member of an underrepresented group or a marginalized group or an equity owed group, whatever term you want to use, then they are almost by default vulnerable. And if they're almost by default vulnerable, then it's easier to not include them in the study, right? Because you don't want to handle the vulnerability of the population, right? Like the way that things are actually set up in many institutional research ethics boards today, it's a lot easier to say that my research project actually has no intersection with Indigenous communities than it is to actually go through the effort to make sure that my research project actually has lots of intersection with Indigenous communities. When in reality, my research project might have so much intersection with Indigenous communities, I can't do it without them, right? But if the activation energy to involve Indigenous communities is so high that I don't want to, then I'm not going to, right? That's so this is the flip side of making sure that there's rigor, because the flip side of making sure there's rigor is it takes effort to make sure there's rigor, right? And
I know that we're now training graduate students in rigor and reproducibility.
Yes.
As a federal requirement.
Yes.
But has that got as far as the ethics committee?
Well, that's a good question.
And I can't answer that. And I used to teach rigor and reproducibility, so that's something for me to go and look into.
Right. But then in the context of rigor and reproducibility, are we teaching them to think about all the sources of bias? Are we teaching them to think about what happens if we don't ask the right question? What happens if so you can have a completely internally consistent set of data which are highly reproducible, but if the question wasn't created in a rigorous way, the results are meaningless.
I clearly need to get you to look through my materials.
I would be happy to go through your materials.
They're a little dated now. Thank you, Mahadeo. I always enjoy our conversations. That one was particularly insightful. So we're going to move on. The next video that I have with Mahadeo will be talking about how we view science as a meritocracy and how DEI slots into that. So please join us for that video next. Thank you for joining us. Please go and subscribe to our channels, so mine and also the Idea STEM YouTube channel. Please like the video, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.